In this video, we're going to show you how to remove and replace the passenger side drive axle. 21 millimeter, take the lug nuts off. Just take that tire right off. Remove the axle castle nut here, which is a 32 millimeter socket. We're going to take that right off. So now we're going to remove this tie rod end. First thing we're going to take off is the cotter pin to remove that castle nut. Now this cotter pin looks like it's been changed recently. I'm going to tell you it doesn't matter. We're always going to put a new cotter pin in. Literally pennies is what they cost. So don't cheap out for safety. Perfect. 17 millimeter socket, and I'm going to remove this castle nut. I'm going to leave it on just a hair like that, so when I hit this knuckle for the sleeve to fall out of that, it won't just drop down. Now we can just move that out of the way. Now we're going to move on right here to that ball joint. I'm going to give it a little spray, some penetrating spray. Hopefully we can get it to loosen up a little easier. All right, it's a 19 millimeter. In this case, I'm going to use a wrench because I can't get a socket in there. I'm going to try to break that free. That's pretty good. But now I'm just going to get a nice little speed wrench. The reason why that's getting tight is due to the rust. I'm just going to reverse it for a second. Spray it again. See if I can get some of that, really loosen that rust up. And take that nut completely off. All right, now we have to separate that ball joint from the knuckle. We got to get that stud out. I'm going to try to use a tool that won't damage the boot first. I might give it a smack right here to see if I can loosen it up, and maybe we won't have to use any tools. So let's do this first. Nope. All right, so we'll get the tool. So this tool right here has different levels to go to. I'm going to choose the highest pin, and what happens is you put the fork right here between the boot and the knuckle, and then this little finger type tool goes on the top, and it's going to push that stud down. I'm going to use the bolt. First, I like to line any thread with any tool with oil. That helps it from getting cross-threaded with pressure. And it saves the boot. So right now I'm hoping to do no damage to this ball joint because it isn't bad, it has no movement. But if I damage that boot with like a pickle fork, I have to replace it because it's just going to cause damage in the future. So the socket on this happens to be a 24 millimeter. So socket and ratchet. I'm just going to see if I can pop this ball joint right out. Now I'm going to take my pry bar and I'm just going to pull this lower control arm ball joint right out of that knuckle. And there we have it, just like that. And now I'm just going to tap the axle and let it fall out of that bearing. If you need to get a punch, try to push that center piece out. So I have a punch that I'm going to keep right there in the center, and I'm going to just push that right out. See if I can get it to move a little bit more. So now I got it as far as I could. So I put a pry bar on the back, and I can just lift it and hold that, pry that axle right out of that knuckle. So now you can just grab the rotor, lift that up, and get that out of the way. Now we're going to raise the vehicle up to get a good shot at the inner part of that CV axle where it goes into the transmission, drivetrain, and we'll pop it out so we can get the axle completely out. All right, so now we've raised our vehicle. We have the inner part of the axle where it goes into that transfer case, transmission. And I've got a pan down below because you could lose some transmission fluid. So you take a pry bar and you're going to just pop it right out. It will take several times. So I tried with the pry bar, as you saw. So now I want to use what they call a fork tool to get in there and really break that free. But this mount, this little T-bone mount for the transmission is in the way, so I'm just going to unbolt it. There's 4 bolts that mount it, 2 to the transmission housing and 2 to the subframe. And it's 14mm socket. We're just going to remove it. So what I have here is what they call a CV axle, like a fork, like a pickle fork for a tie rod end. It has a bit of a wedge to it. See the form? Try to make sure you don't damage any housing or seal, and just wedge it in there. Eventually it's supposed to pop it out. Yeah, so I helped move it out with the fork, enough to get my pry bar really behind there and set that free. I'm going to grab the one end right by the knuckle, and I'm just going to guide it right out. Oh, no fluid, perfect. Bring it right through that fender well. So on the end that goes into the transmission, this is what they have, a lock clip, and it squeezes as it goes into the splines of the gear. I personally don't like to install it with the split on the top, see the split? Because then gravity's kind of doing its force against you. I like to make sure that the split is on the bottom, and then the gravity work for you. So you're going to guide that right through. And it goes without saying, if fluid is already leaking before you even started this job, replace that dust seal. Ours is dry, so we don't need it. Confirm the brake is on the bottom. Line it up. Feel it catch some splines. And then I might have to lower it to give it a good push, but you're going to need to get some little push into it, so I'm going to bring it down and try to get it in there. All right, so raise it so that it's level, parallel with the actual axle, and just keep giving it a push, just like that. Pull it back out, confirm that it's locked in. And now we're going to lift it back up and look at the transaxle. All right, so now I put my axle in. I can see that it's flush with the transmission. Nice, made a nice contact. It's in there. And now I can remount that little T-bone strut. There are 5 bolts to this. Make sure you pay attention and put the 2 long ones into the subframe side, and the 3 go into the transmission. So we're going to line that right up like that. And I'm going to put one of the short ones right here in the front. Start it by hand. The good news is that transmission is pretty free-flowing. The whole block is, so we can do that like that. Make sure you move it if you have to get centered. Start everything by hand, so there's no chance of cross-threading. We got 2 more in here. And I'm just going to snug them up, then I will torque them to factory spec. That's the 14mm socket. So the torque specs is 38.3 foot-pounds. 14mm socket, and I'm going to tighten them up. And then go to the frame. So now I'm going to let you in a little tech secret. I like to put a little never sees on these splines, so that way the next person doesn't have to go through the real trouble of getting the splines out of that bearing. Just give it a coat of never sees. I use copper because it's higher temp. And then we can line it up with the actual center of that hub, which is the bearing. Pull that out, bring that spline up, line it up. Just like that. Now we want to line the lower knuckle up with the ball joint. Just pull down on the control arm and line that up. Pops up in. Now we'll get that nut for the ball joint. I put the nut on the ball joint stud. I'm going to let you in another little secret toy. So I put this like this. Watch, the spindle is going to start to spin once it gets to a tight spot. Just like that. Now we're going to spin that. So we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to take a rubber mallet, first attempt, and I'm going to see if I can put that ball joint spindle right up into that knuckle so it won't spin. See if I can get it to seat. Now we'll try to spin that again. It's still spinning. So now we get the pole jack. We got to put pressure on that to let that ball joint seat. Now I've got my pole jack, and I'm going to center it right below that ball joint, and I'm going to spin it up and put pressure. You can see it already seating into that knuckle. I want that pressure on there so that I can turn that nut and lock that ball joint down. Okay, 19mm wrench. Let's see if we can get this down to tighten. All right, so I snugged that down. There is a torque spec on it, but I don't know how they expect you to get a socket and a torque wrench in there, so I'm going to put the tie rod end on to give myself a little bit more push and leverage, and we're going to use a long 19mm and really snug that down. So now we're going to put the tie rod in, back into the knuckle, take that castle nut off, line it up, push it up, put the castle nut on, and that is 17mm socket, and the torque specs on that is 24.5 foot-pounds. Now you have to line up the slot for the cotter pin, so take a light, and it's okay if you go over a little bit, which in this case I just have to go like a little 1/8 of an inch. Check out the alignment. That looks pretty good. I'm going to get myself a new cotter pin and just guide it all the way through. Make sure it bottoms out. Then I like to take the first half of it, bring it over, hammer it down, then cut it off right there. And then take the bottom, I'll cut it, and then hammer that part down. Now it's in there. So the ball joint is supposed to be 65 foot-pounds. Like I said, I can't get a socket and a torque wrench in there, so a nice long ratchet, 19 millimeter wrench, shall I say, and I'm going to really tighten it. Sometimes a good, quick jerking motion will really snug that down. One more. That's pretty tight. We take our pole jack out. So now I'm going to put my new castle nut on, right on the axle. Snug it down. Key on these is to never over tighten or not tighten them properly, because that wheel bearing will be destroyed. So 32 millimeter socket, I'm going to snug it. Now I'm going to torque this to 217 foot-pounds. Some cars you can put the wheel on and take the center cap out, which in this case I can. So I'm going to put the tire on, lower it, and then I will torque the axle nut and the wheels. .21 millimeter is the lug nut size. Snug them up in a crisscross pattern. Now we'll lower it and torque both items. All right, so wheel torque on this particular vehicle is 67 to 80 foot-pounds. I'm going to go with the higher because of the age and the age of the studs. Thread gets a little stretched, so I want to make sure it's tight. Double check. Now I can tighten that axle nut. 32 millimeter socket on that axle nut, and the torque is 217 foot-pounds. Even with the tire on, I can get a nice long punch in there, and I'm going to peen over that end of the lip so that it's a safety lock. Now just replace the center cap. After finishing this installation, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle. When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.